When a combat veteran grappling with PTSD resolved to demolish an ancient termite mound on his property, his sole focus was on preserving his ranch. However, the instant he ignited the bulldozer, Jax, his devoted therapy dog, underwent a profound transformation. The dog, trained to instill serenity, was now barking frenetically, lunging between the machinery and the mound, frantically clawing at a distinct spot. Paul froze. His canine companion wasn't yelping at a serpent. It was yelping at the earth. And when Paul's own spade eventually struck metal, he comprehended that Jax wasn't attempting to hinder him from uncovering something. He was endeavoring to prevent something beneath from realizing their presence. We hope you will support the channel by subscribing. The elevated desert expanse of Otto County, New Mexico, was an unyielding expanse of white sunlight. It had observed the land dehydrate for 200 consecutive days without a single significant drop of precipitation. The Weston Ranch, once a humble area of struggling grassland, was now merely a parched brown expanse of dust and brittle yucca skeletal remains. Paul Weston stood on the distorted planks of his front veranda. A ceramic mug of chilled coffee remained untouched in his hand. A faint, anxious whimper emanated from his side. Jax, a 7-year-old German shepherd, persistently nudged his cool, moist nose into Paul's palm. The dog's fur was a striking blend of pristine white and deep gray, thick and robust, akin to a winter wolf displaced in the desert. Paul lowered his gaze, his expression softening. "I recognize it, boy. I recognize it." Paul was a man in his early 50s, tall and slender, with the deliberate, economical movements of someone who had dedicated a lifetime to working the land. His brown hair, a touch too long, was streaked with silver at the temples. His face was weathered and rugged, sculpted by the sun and memories equally harsh. Yet, his blue eyes held a profound, settled benevolence that had endured. He was a former Army Ranger, though that existence felt eons away, a narrative belonging to another individual. Paul's hand, which had involuntarily tightened into a fist at the sight of his barren pasture, relaxed under the dog's gentle pressure. Jax was more than just a companion. He was an anchor. The dog had been rescued from a shelter in Alamo Gordo, but Paul frequently pondered who had truly rescued whom. Jax was officially trained as a PTSD service animal. He was attuned to the subtle tempests that gathered behind Paul's eyes. The shallow breathing, the clenched jaw, the distant stare that signaled Paul was no longer in New Mexico, but in some remote region of Afghanistan. Jax's mission was to guide him back. Paul's gaze drifted from the horizon to the worn kitchen table visible through the screen door. A solitary white envelope lay there, stark and official. It was the third one that month from the bank. He didn't need to open it. He knew the polite, merciless lexicon of foreclosure by heart. The name on the letterhead would be Daisy Brooks, a senior loan officer he had never encountered, but whose printed signature felt like a crushing blow. The drought had suffocated the life from this ranch, and the bank was simply awaiting the settling of the dust before claiming its remains. "We're running out of time, Jax," Paul murmured, placing the mug down. Jax whimpered again, a low hum of shared apprehension, and leaned his full weight against Paul's leg. Paul's eyes surveyed the property beyond the empty cattle pens and the dry trough to the northern pasture. It was the only section of the ranch he conscientiously avoided. At its core, rising from the flatlands like a forgotten monument, stood the object the locals referred to as the Petrified Mound. It was a colossal, ancient structure, taller than his 2-bedroom ranch house and wider than his barn. It was a dense, reddish-gray anomaly of solidified, fossilized clay and stone that protruded from the earth like a fractured tooth. It had existed indefinitely, a landmark on archaic Spanish maps, a place the Mescalero Apache were reputedly advised to shun. His grandfather had always proclaimed the mound to be a source of misfortune, a location where the earth held its breath. Paul did not subscribe to superstitions of bad luck, but he had faith in geological principles. The ground for 100 yards surrounding the mound was remarkably barren, as if the structure drained vitality from the soil. However, Paul harbored a desperate, pragmatic theory. He believed such a massive, enduring structure could only have formed and persisted if it rested atop a stable, deep water source. An untapped spring, perhaps nourished by the Sacramento Mountains. A spring the drought had not yet succeeded in extinguishing. It represented his final hope. The bank demanded assets. Water was the sole asset that truly mattered. He had broached the idea to his neighbor, Raymond Scott, at the feed store in Tolosa the previous week. Raymond, a corpulent man whose countenance was a permanent roadmap of sun damage, had simply shaken his head, the brim of his dusty cap low over his eyes. "You're pursuing phantoms, Paul," Raymond asserted, his voice raspy. "That thing predates sin. My grandfather attempted to demolish it in 1973. Didn't even leave a mark. You'll ruin your bulldozer before you damage that mound. It's best to simply leave it be." But Paul could not leave it be. Daisy Brooks would not permit him to. Today, he would move the immovable. The sun was a searing smear of orange and purple by the time Paul engaged the tracks. The venerable yellow bulldozer, a relic from the 1980s, emitted a plume of black smoke and groaned as it lurched forward. The air became permeated with the pungent scent of diesel and hot, dry metal. Jax observed from a safe distance near the ranch truck, a gray and white sentinel against the brown earth. His ears were perked and alert. Paul approached the mound deliberately. He lowered the massive steel blade and advanced the throttle. A terrible, high-pitched grinding sound reverberated through the air as metal encountered the rock-hard surface. The bulldozer bucked, its tracks ejecting dust, the blades screeching, shaving off a few fragments of gray clay that were as hard as concrete. It was precisely like attempting to dislodge a mountain. Paul gritted his teeth, sweat stinging his eyes. He reversed the machine, drew a breath, and then throttled forward again, impacting the mound with greater force. The collision sent a significant jolt up his spine. The engine roared, but the mound remained steadfast. Frustration, intense and familiar, began to surge within his chest. He backed up once more, angrier this time, poised to hurl the machine into the unyielding wall. Suddenly, a series of frantic, piercing barks penetrated the engine's roar. It wasn't Jax's customary warning bark. This was an alarm. This was sheer panic. Paul abruptly pulled back the throttle, the engine decelerating to a rumbling idle. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and glanced over. Jax was no longer positioned by the truck. The dog was at the base of the mound, approximately 20 yards to the left of the bulldozer, in a state of utter frenzy. Jax was running in tight, agitated circles around one specific spot. He would halt, bark at the ground, and then commence digging furiously, his powerful front paws sending clumps of dry dirt flying. He emitted a high-pitched whine, dug again, then looked back at Paul, barking with a sharp, desperate urgency that sent a chill down Paul's spine. "Jax, heel!" Paul commanded. The dog disregarded him. He persisted in digging, barking, and circling. Paul observed for another 10 seconds. This was not typical. This wasn't Jax spotting a rabbit or a rattlesnake. His demeanor for those situations was different, more focused, less chaotic. This was something entirely distinct. The dog's behavior was so erratic, so utterly uncharacteristic, that it bypassed Paul's frustration and activated his old instincts. Something was amiss. He pulled the heavy lever, disengaging the hydraulics. The massive steel blade dropped to the ground with a dull, heavy thud. He shut off the engine. The sudden, immense silence of the desert enveloped them, broken only by Jax's frenetic digging and sharp, insistent barks. Paul Weston swung himself down from the cab, his heart beating a heavy, steady rhythm against his ribs. He walked toward his dog, his eyes fixed on the patch of barren earth that commanded Jax's terrified attention. The desert silence was vast and immediate. The rumbling diesel heart of the bulldozer was stilled, and the only remaining sounds were the dry scrape of Paul's boots on the dirt and the anxious, panting breaths of his dog. Jax had ceased barking, but he remained fixated on the spot he had excavated. He looked up at Paul, his intelligent gray and white face filled with a peculiar, urgent confusion, and then back at the hole, whining softly in his throat. "Easy, boy," Paul murmured, his voice quiet in the sudden stillness. "What is it? What has you so startled?" Trusting the dog's instincts, which had never once failed him, Paul returned to the bulldozer and unhooked the heavy steel shovel he kept strapped to its side. He came back to the spot, the fading light of the sun casting long purple shadows across the hard-packed earth. He thrust the shovel tip into the ground where Jax had been digging. The soil was dense, almost like concrete, intermingled with the same fossilized clay as the mound itself. He placed his boot on the shovel's shoulder and drove it deep. For a few minutes, the only sound was the rhythmic scrape and grunt of his labor as he tossed aside clumps of dry, reddish dirt. Jax watched, pacing in a tight circle, his body tense. The shovel head bit into the soil, and then, with a heavy metallic resonance that vibrated up the wooden handle, it struck something solid. Paul froze. The vibration was wrong. It wasn't the dull, flat thud of a rock. It was a deep, hollow clang. He scraped the shovel tip across the object, clearing more dirt. A harsh, grating sound of metal on metal echoed in the quiet. His heart, which had been pounding from the exertion, now began to beat with a different rhythm, a slow, heavy drum of apprehension. "Back, Jax," he commanded, his voice a low instruction. He worked faster now, no longer digging deep, but scraping wide, clearing the surface. Jax, caught up in the energy, moved to the other side of the expanding hole and began digging with his own paws, sending arcs of dirt flying behind him. Together, man and dog toiled against the compacted soil, battling the obstinate grip of time. Gradually, an edge was unveiled, then a corner, followed by a flat, dark expanse of pitted, corroded iron. Another 20 minutes of arduous, breathless exertion passed before the object was fully exposed. Paul leaned back, breathing heavily, his hands tingling. It was a hatch, a precisely engineered, heavy-duty steel square, at least 4 ft by 4 ft, seamlessly embedded in the earth. Its metal composition was significantly thicker than anything a civilian would utilize for a water tank or septic system. Heavily oxidized rivets punctuated its perimeter, and at its core rested a massive, recessed ring-pull handle as stout as Paul's wrist. He knelt, his knee joints audibly cracking. This was no farmer's root cellar. His hand, encased in a worn leather work glove, moved towards the hatch's center. He commenced scraping away decades of baked-on sun-hardened grime. The dirt was as tenacious as concrete, yet he clawed at it with his fingernails and the edge of his shovel. A distinct form began to surface, faded pale blue paint beneath the rust. Paul's breath hitched in his throat. It was the winged star emblem of the United States Air Force. Faded but unequivocally identifiable. A chilling dread, sharp and acrid, engulfed him, completely overshadowing the desert's heat. This was his property. It had belonged to his father and his grandfathers. What was a hidden Air Force installation doing here? He rubbed more frantically at the surface beneath the insignia. Stenciled letters, stark and military grade, materialized beneath his glove. He articulated the words aloud, his voice sounding peculiar and faint in the open expanse. Project Nightfall. He scraped further down, his heart thumping against his ribs. 1968. And beneath that, a final unsettling admonition. Unauthorized entry prohibited. Paul settled back on his heels. As a former Army Ranger, he had encountered secure facilities. He recognized the appearance of mil-spec military specification. This was it. The precise welds, the non-commercial hardware, the sheer density of the steel. This was more than just a bunker. It was a high-security containment unit. It was designed to exclude people, or, he mused with a sudden, dark shiver, to confine something within. 1968. the year he had turned 6. As if summoned by the date, his surroundings began to transform. A low moaning sound, which Paul had initially mistaken for ringing in his own ears, started to intensify from the west. The wind, which had been quiescent throughout the day, was now gaining momentum. He scanned the horizon. The sun was a fading ember, and the sky above it was no longer purple, but a solid, churning wall of brown. A dust storm was rapidly approaching. The wind struck him, a sudden cold gust of grit that stung his eyes and face. Jax flattened his ears against the wind, pressing close to Paul's side. Paul gazed down at the heavy ring handle. He needed to know what lay inside. But not like this. Not with a storm descending, not with the light diminishing, not without understanding what he was getting into. Whatever Project Nightfall entailed, it had waited 60 years. It could endure one more night. "Come on, boy," he uttered, his voice rough. "Let's head home." He retrieved the shovel, and with Jax remaining close to his heels, walked back to the house as the initial wave of sandblasting wind buffeted the ranch. He bypassed the bulldozer. He endured a sleepless night. The wind howled against the small dwelling. A high, thin shriek that resembled the cry of something in distress. A fine silt began to infiltrate beneath the door and through the window frames, coating every surface in a layer of brown dust. Paul sat in his old armchair in the darkness. The storm was an unseen monstrous entity attempting to force its way in, but the true tempest raged within his own mind. Project Nightfall, 1968. The words persistently echoed. He had spent years attempting to suppress his own past, his military service, the experiences and actions from the mountains of Afghanistan. Now it appeared the past had literally been exhumed in his own backyard. And then, the connection that had been lingering on the periphery of his consciousness finally solidified. His father, Mason Weston. Mason had been a quiet, fastidious man, an engineer who perpetually smelled of graphite and coffee. He had worked at Holloman Air Force Base, just over the ridge. He had taken pride in his work, though he never once discussed it. It had been classified. Paul recalled 1968 not as a year, but as a sensation. He remembered his father returning home late, his countenance pallid with exhaustion. He remembered his parents murmuring in the kitchen, the words test and problem and containment drifting through the air. Mason Weston had passed away just a few years later in 1973. A sudden, massive heart attack the doctors had attributed to excessive stress. He was only 45. Paul had been a mere boy, and his father's death had been a sharp, disorienting blow. Now, sitting in the darkness with the wind screaming, he felt an icy certainty. The two elements were interconnected. The project his father had worked on and the secret buried beneath his land. Jax, perceiving the shift in his owner's demeanor, moved from the rug and rested his heavy, warm head on Paul's knee. The dog emitted a soft, low whine, as if responding to the spectral presences that had just entered the room. Paul placed his hand on the dog's head, his fingers tracing the familiar contours of his ears. The simple, steadfast presence of the animal was the sole impediment to the burgeoning panic. "What did you do, Dad?" Paul whispered into the darkness. "What did you bury out there?" He gazed out the window at the roaring brown obscurity. The quest for water was complete. A different, far more perilous search had just commenced. He would await the storm's abatement, and then, in the morning, he would discover the truth. The dawn broke clear and cold, as if the dust storm had scrubbed the sky clean, leaving it a pallid, indifferent blue. The world was coated in a fine brown powder, a fresh layer of dust atop the old. Paul Weston did not linger for the sun to bring warmth. He had been awake all night, the name Project Nightfall reverberating in his mind with every shriek of the passing wind. He donned his heavy work boots, his movements stiff. Jax was already by the door, his body language a stark contrast to his usual morning vivacity. There was no tail wagging, no playful nudging for breakfast. The dog stood rigid, his ears erect, his gaze fixed on the screen door as if he could already perceive the unearthed secret from across the yard. "I know, boy," Paul stated, his voice a low rumble. I have to know." He proceeded to the barn, the cold air biting at his lungs. He assembled his tools with the grim efficiency of a soldier preparing for a mission. A 6-foot steel pry bar, a small sledgehammer, a heavy-duty climbing rope he used for mending the old windmill, and a high-powered battery-operated flashlight. When he reached the north pasture, Jax was already there, but he maintained a distance from the mound, standing near the bulldozer, a silent gray and white sentinel. Paul walked to the edge of the excavation and looked down at the steel hatch, the stenciled Air Force insignia appearing even more ominous in the sharp morning light. The locking mechanism was a recessed steel wheel, reminiscent of a submarine's, rusted into a solid block. Paul wedged the tip of the pry bar into one of the spokes and exerted his full weight against it. The bar remained unyielding. The metal had fused due to 60 years of subterranean stillness. "All right," he muttered to himself. He repositioned the pry bar and lifted the sledgehammer. The sound of the hammer striking the bar was a sharp, percussive clang that seemed to puncture the desert's quiet. He struck it repeatedly, and with a final desperate heave on the bar, a sound like a bone snapping reverberated from the mechanism. A sharp, wrenching crack of metal. The wheel rotated just an inch with a groan of rusted anguish. And then it commenced. A loud, sustained hissing sound erupted from the entire perimeter of the hatch. It was the sound of a tomb exhaling, of a 60-year-old differential rapidly equalizing. A brittle black rubber gasket, which had maintained airtight integrity for decades, cracked and tore, releasing the vacuum. For Paul, it was merely the sound of an old seal breaking. He was completely unaware that this simple act of physics had just activated a silent, low-frequency transmitter, a long-dormant alarm powered by a tiny, decaying core of radioactive material, sending its first pulse in half a century out into the world. As the air rushed out, the odor assailed them. Jax, who had crept closer, yelped as if struck. The dog scrambled backward, his claws tearing at the hard dirt, and he began to bark, a frantic, deep-chested warning bark filled with primal fear. Paul flinched, covering his nose and mouth with his arm. It was not the smell of decomposition, nor of death. It was a sharp, sterile scent of chemicals and ozone, of mold and something profoundly metallic, like old, superheated oil. It was the odor of a machine that had been left to decay in the darkness. "Easy, Jax, easy. It's just stale air," Paul shouted over the dog's barking. But Jax would not be pacified. He paced at a safe distance, his head lowered, his ears flat, barking a continuous, desperate warning at the open hole. Paul gripped the thick ring handle and with a grunt pulled the massive steel door open. It scraped loudly over the dirt, revealing a square of perfect, impenetrable blackness. A steel ladder was bolted to the side, its rungs disappearing into the dark. Paul looked at Jax. "Watch my back, boy. Stay." The dog whined, a high, thin sound of protest, but he sat trembling, his eyes fixed on Paul. Paul secured the climbing rope to the bulldozer's blade, creating a solid anchor. He clipped the flashlight to his belt, checked the rope's knot, and swung his legs over the edge. His boots found the first rung. It was cold, slick with a fine, oily rust. He began to descend. The light of the world vanished. The air grew colder, damper. The chemical odor was suffocating, coating the inside of his throat. 10 feet down. 15. His boots struck a solid metal-plated floor. He unclipped his flashlight and activated it. The beam cut a sharp white cone through the blackness. He found himself in a confined, roughly 10 by 10-foot square chamber. The walls consisted of riveted steel panels, their paint visibly flaking from dampness. Pipes and robust cables crisscrossed the ceiling. In the distant wall, a narrow, dark aperture revealed itself, a tunnel descending further into the earth. The sight struck Paul with physical force. The cramped quarters, the pervasive oily chemical scent, and the black, waiting maw of the tunnel. His present reality dissolved. He ceased to be Paul Weston, a New Mexico rancher. Instead, he was Sergeant Weston, reliving Tora Bora, Afghanistan, 2003. The air was heavy with gunpowder and perspiration. The man in front of him whispered, gesturing him forward into a shadowy cave entrance. He felt the crushing weight of the mountain above him, a sudden, paralyzing dread that the rocks would shift, burying him alive in the darkness. His breath hitched, his chest tightened. He couldn't draw air. Paul gasped, his back hitting the bunker's cold steel wall with a thud. The flashlight beam quivered, dancing erratically over the peeling paint. "Get out! Get out now! It's a trap! It's collapsing!" Panic, a living entity, clutched at his heart with an icy grip. His hand, slick with sweat, fumbled for the rope he had left dangling. From far above, muffled yet distinct, he heard it. A sound out of place in Afghanistan. A frantic, incessant barking. It was Jack's. The barking was followed by the desperate, rhythmic scrape, scrape, scrape of heavy claws on the metal hatch overhead. The dog wasn't just alerting him. Jack sensed his distress. The dog was frantically trying to dig his way down, attempting to reach him. The sound sliced through his panic like a blade. "Jax is up there. I am in New Mexico. I am on my ranch." He drew a shuddering, painful breath of the acrid air. I'm okay, boy," he choked out, his voice a hollow echo. He pushed himself off the wall, his limbs trembling. He had to escape, but he couldn't leave empty-handed. "1 minute, Jax, I'm coming," he shouted, his voice gaining strength, forcibly ejecting the last vestiges of the flashback. He compelled himself to survey the room, concentrating on the task at hand. His shaky flashlight beam located a metal shelf. Upon it sat a thick, leather-bound book coated in mildew. He seized it. It was a technical ledger. Beside it lay a yellow, boxy device with a handle and a meter, a Geiger counter. He noticed the needle on the gauge, and in the sudden silence as he held his breath, he heard it. A faint but undeniable slow tick, tick, tick. It wasn't alarming, but it wasn't silent. On the floor beneath the shelf rested a small gray metal box, resembling a 1960s military ammo can. He grabbed its handle. A clatter from above. Jax's claws had slipped on the steel hatch. The barking became frantic, high-pitched. "That's enough! Get out! Get out now!" Paul tucked the small box and the ledger under one arm and clutched the Geiger counter with his free hand. He moved toward the ladder, his boots ringing loudly on the rungs. He began his ascent, pulling himself up hand over hand, his lungs burning. He burst through the hatch, scrambling onto the dusty ground, collapsing onto his hands and knees, gasping the clean, sharp, beautiful desert air. Instantly, Jax was upon him. The dog whined, a series of short, high-pitched yelps licking his face, ears, and neck, nudging him with his cold nose, his entire body trembling with relieved anxiety. "I'm okay, boy, I'm okay." Paul panted, dropping the retrieved items in the dust. He wrapped his arms around the dog's thick neck, burying his face in the warm gray and white fur, grounding himself in the solid, living reality of his companion. "I'm okay. You're a good boy. You brought me back." He remained there for a long time, the sun on his face, his heart pounding, the scent of dust and dog overpowering the chemical specters from below. Only when his hands steadied did he finally direct his gaze to the 3 objects he had extracted from the darkness. The sun receded, taking with it the day's last warmth and leaving the high desert cold and expansive. Paul had secured the heavy steel hatch, sliding it back into place with a grating shriek of metal, then driven the bulldozer over it, covering the entry point with its heavy, stationary blade. It wasn't an impeccable hiding spot, but it would suffice. Now, inside his small, brightly lit kitchen, the 3 artifacts from the bunker rested on his clean pine table, appearing alien and incongruous. The yellow Geiger counter sat by the sink. Its faint, slow ticking created a soft, unsettling rhythm in the quiet room. A low level, but not zero. Not natural background radiation. The small gray metal box was latched. He had opened it to reveal 3 neatly stacked reels of audio tape, their plastic cases marked with the same military-style font. Project Nightfall, followed by dates from 1968. He possessed no device to play them. He redirected his attention to the ledger. Its leather cover was stiff and warped, emitting the same chemical moldy odor that had triggered his panic. He opened it cautiously. The pages were thick, high-quality stock, filled with rows of meticulous, faded blue ink. It was not a personal journal. It was a technical log. Paul's military background helped him navigate some of the jargon, but it was dense. Columns detailed geological stress tests, sub-level 3 containment integrity, and seismic variance. There were dates, times, and initials. He noted his father's initials, MW, next to several entries. Most were routine. Pressure steady, sensors green. But as he delved deeper into 1968, the entries grew erratic. July 17, 1968. MW test for alpha. Pressure variance noted. Sensor 09 failing. July 19, 1968. MW containment integrity at 95%. Recommending immediate halt. July 20, 1968. Entry by new initials. MW temporarily relieved. Test 4 Bravo authorized. July 22, 1968. Anomaly. All sensors red. Sub-level 3 sealed. Site lockdown ordered. The final entry, scrawled in a frantic, almost illegible hand, was from 2 days later. Site B lockdown permanent. Level 1 entry sealed. This is over. This is done. Paul stared at the page, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. His father had attempted to halt it. They had relieved him of duty and proceeded. And then, the anomaly. He glanced at Jax, who lay by the back door, head resting on paws, watching Paul. The dog's tail gave a single, slow thump, as if to say, "I'm still here." Paul closed the book, the musty scent rising from its pages. He felt a profound, weary sadness for his father, a man he barely remembered, who had apparently fought a solitary battle in that subterranean room. Far away, in a windowless, climate-controlled facility outside Washington, D.C., a single red light began to flash on a forgotten monitoring board. The low-frequency signal transmitted by the 60-year-old RTG was weak, but the system, inexplicably still active, received it. It registered the compromised seal at Site B, Otto County, New Mexico. Within minutes, an automated alert was dispatched to a highly specialized private contractor tasked with managing old, erased government liabilities. Paul, unaware, rubbed his face. The adrenaline from the bunker long dissipated, leaving only exhaustion and a mild dread. He checked the locks on his doors, extinguished the kitchen light, and sank into his old armchair in the living room, too agitated to sleep. Jax left his spot and curled up on the rug at Paul's feet. The house was silent. The faint tick of the Geiger counter in the kitchen was the sole sound, a tiny radioactive cricket. Hours passed. Paul must have drifted off, his head tilted back, his dreams filled with dark tunnels and the smell of ozone. He was roused by a profound, sudden stillness. Jax was no longer at his feet. The dog stood rigid in the center of the darkened room. Paul remained motionless. He didn't even breathe. He watched his dog. Jax was a statue of muscle and fur. His head was cocked, his body aimed at the front door. The fur along his spine, from his neck to the base of his tail, was bristling. And then Paul heard it. Not a bark, but a low, vibrating sound, almost too faint to perceive. It was a growl, rumbling deep in the dog's chest, a sound of absolute territorial warning. Jax took a slow, deliberate step toward the door. Seconds later, Paul heard it. The soft, unmistakable crunch of tires on his gravel driveway. The sound was alien. No one came to the Weston ranch at this hour. Not Raymond Scott. Not anyone. Paul swung his legs off the chair, his stocking feet making no sound on the wooden floor. He moved to the front window, Jax instantly at his side. A silent gray shadow. Paul carefully opened the blind a fraction of an inch. A vehicle was parked 30 yards from his house. It was a large black SUV, perfectly clean, its paint reflecting the pale moonlight. It appeared fresh from a showroom. In the dry, dusty environment of Otto County, it was as out of place as a spacecraft. The headlights were off. 2 doors opened and closed with quiet, solid thuds. 2 men. They walked toward the house, their steps assured. They were not locals. Paul moved to the door, his heart beating a hard, fast rhythm. Jax was pressed against his leg, the growl still vibrating. "Easy, boy," Paul whispered. A sharp, official knock echoed through the small house. Paul flipped on the porch light. He took a breath, unlocked the deadbolt, and opened the door 6 inches, keeping his body and foot behind it. Jax immediately filled the gap, pushing his head and shoulders into the opening, his eyes fixed on the men. They were in suits, dark, well-pressed suits. Their shoes were polished, reflecting the porch light, somehow untouched by the ranch's grime. The older man, Tucker, appeared to be in his 50s, with neat gray hair and a calm, almost pleasant face, except for his eyes, which were flat and empty. The younger one, Reese, in his 30s, was fit with a sharp, impatient face and dark hair. He was the one who regarded Jax with overt annoyance. "Mr. Paul Weston?" the older man, Tucker, inquired, his voice smooth and educated. "Who's asking?" Paul replied, his voice hoarse from sleep. "My name is Tucker. This is my associate, Reese. We're affiliated with the Bureau of Land Management." Paul's blood ran cold. The deception was too seamless, too swift. "BLM?" Paul stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "It's almost midnight." "We understand the hour is inconvenient, sir," Tucker proceeded, his composed smile unwavering. "We received an automated report of significant unauthorized excavation on this property. We're obligated to inspect the site for environmental and treaty compliance." Reese, the younger individual, shifted his stance, his gaze darting between Paul and the dog. "We need to examine the excavation site, sir. Standard procedure, if you'll just step aside." Reese took a partial step towards the entrance. It was his only movement. Jax, who had been a silent, menacing statue, erupted. A profound, chest-rattling growl emanated from the dog's throat. He didn't bark. He bared his teeth. The muscles in his shoulders bunched, and he lowered his head, poised to lunge. He was no longer a service animal. He was a highly trained protector, a gray and white barrier. Reese froze, his hand instinctively moving towards his jacket before Tucker shot him a look. Both men recognized the sound. That wasn't a mere warning. It was an unequivocal promise. Paul placed his hand on Jax's neck, the dog's muscles coiled like steel springs. "He's protective," Paul stated, articulating the obvious. "We observe that," Tucker responded, his polite facade still intact. He looked past Paul, his eyes surveying the dimly lit room, then returned his gaze to the dog. He was a professional, evaluating a potential threat. He assessed Paul, a tall, fit man with a military bearing, and the dog, a clear and present danger. He understood they couldn't force their way in without a loud, violent, and unpredictable outcome. "This is private property," Paul declared, his voice stern and cold. "You have no warrant, and the BLM does not conduct house calls at midnight. You need to depart now." Reese appeared to want to object, but Tucker raised a hand. "Very well, Mr. Weston. We do not desire any altercation." He took a step backward, drawing Reese with him. "We will, however, be compelled to file this as non-compliance. We will return at a more suitable time." "You do that," Paul retorted. Tucker offered a thin reptilian smile, turned, and the 2 men retreated to their immaculate SUV. They did not rush. They entered, the doors closed, and the engine initiated with a low, powerful hum. The SUV reversed, turned, and drove off, its red taillights vanishing down the gravel road. Paul secured the door. The sound of the deadbolt sliding home was conspicuously loud in the sudden silence. He rested his forehead against the cool wood, his body trembling, not from fear, but from a massive surge of adrenaline. Jax whined, his entire body relaxing. He nudged Paul's hand, his tail performing a brief, anxious wag. Paul slid to the floor and embraced his dog. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "What a good boy, Jax. You held the line." He remained there in the dark, his heart pounding. The ledger wasn't merely a relic from his father's past. It was a live secret, and the individuals who had concealed it were still standing guard. The deadbolt sliding home in the pre-dawn darkness did nothing to alleviate Paul's sense of safety. The visit from Tucker and Reese had shattered the illusion of his isolation. They weren't just anonymous bankers like Daisy Brooks. They were shadowy figures who knew his name and his whereabouts. He did not sleep. Instead, he took action. He retrieved the small gray metal box of audio tapes and the heavy, mildewed ledger and proceeded to the back of his bedroom closet. Behind his hanging clothes was an old, cedar-lined hope chest. It had belonged to his wife. He hadn't opened it in the 8 years since her passing. His hand hesitated on the lid, the scent of cedar and faint, lingering perfume hitting him like a physical presence. This felt like a transgression, bringing his new, dark secret into this sacred space. But it was the safest place he knew. He placed the items beneath a neatly folded quilt and a wedding album, then gently closed the lid. The yellow Geiger counter posed a different challenge. He wrapped it in 2 plastic grocery bags, took it to the pantry, and buried it at the very bottom of a 50-elb sack of feed corn. He spent the remaining hours until dawn seated in his armchair, Jax's head resting on his boot. The dog had not left his side, a warm, breathing comfort in the cold room. Paul stared at the kitchen wall, replaying the polite, empty menace in Tucker's eyes and the technical, hurried entries in his father's logbook. He had attempted to stop them, and then he was relieved of duty. The bank, the drought, the foreclosure, it all seemed distant now. This was different. This was not about land. This was about a hole in the ground that had just consumed his past. As the first faint light of morning appeared, Paul realized he couldn't remain. He couldn't combat what he didn't comprehend. The internet was useless for secrets this ancient. He required human memory. There was only one person in Otto County who might recognize a name like Project Nightfall. He placed Jax in the passenger seat of his old pickup truck. The dog sat alert, scanning the horizon as Paul drove the dusty miles into the small town of Tolosa. Paul watched his rearview mirror the entire journey. The dirt road behind him remained empty. No black SUV, no plumes of dust. The very emptiness felt like a threat. He parked in front of a small, tidy bungalow on a quiet street adorned with cottonwood trees. The house was immaculate, featuring a garden of robust, drought-resistant cacti and bright red geraniums. This was the residence of Chloe Sullivan. Chloe, in her late 70s, was a widow who had served as the county's head librarian for 40 years before her retirement. She was a small, delicate-looking woman with kind, perceptive blue eyes magnified by thick glasses. She had known Paul's family his entire life. His late wife had even volunteered with her, reading to children on Saturday mornings. If anyone was the living, breathing historical archive of this county, it was Chloe. She opened the door before he could knock, wiping her hands on an apron. "Paul Weston," she stated, her voice warm but surprised. "And Jax, well, this is a delight." Jax, who adored her, nudged her hand politely, his tail performing a low, friendly sweep. "Morning, Chloe," Paul said, attempting to infuse his voice with a casualness that felt fragile and feigned. "Hope I'm not disturbing you." "Nonsense. I was just preparing tea. You appear as though you could use some. You look as though you haven't slept in a week. Come in, come in." Her living room was the antithesis of his ranch house. It was cozy, overflowing with bookshelves, neat stacks of magazines, and the comforting aroma of lemon oil and brewing Earl Grey tea. "Sit," she commanded, indicating a floral armchair. "Jax knows where his bowl is." Paul sat, his large frame feeling awkward and out of place among her delicate possessions. Jax went directly to a ceramic water bowl kept specifically for him in the kitchen. Chloe returned with 2 steaming mugs. "Now," she said, settling into her own chair. "What brings you all the way into town, Paul? And don't tell me it's for my baking. I haven't seen you since the county fair." Paul wrapped his hands around the warm mug. He had rehearsed this. He had to inquire indirectly. "It's a peculiar question, Chloe. I was clearing some of that unproductive land on the north pasture, the section near the old mound." "Ah, the petrified mound," she nodded. "An unfortunate spot." "It appears so. I was digging and I discovered some old debris, government junk, it seemed, with a name stenciled on it. I was merely curious. Does the name Project Nightfall signify anything to you?" The transformation was instantaneous. Chloe, who had been leaning forward with a friendly smile, ceased movement. Her cup paused halfway to her lips. Her bright blue eyes lost their warmth and sharpened, focusing on him with a new, sudden intensity. "Paul," she said, her voice low and serious, "that is a name I have not heard uttered aloud in over 50 years. Where precisely did you observe it?" "Just on a piece of rusted metal," Paul lied poorly. "Looked like an old barrel lid." "Why, was it something significant?" Chloe placed her cup down on the saucer. The small clinking sound was loud in the quiet room. "Significant?" she mused, staring past him at the bookshelf, at the past. No, it was a shadow. People knew the base was busy then, of course. This was the 1960s, the midst of the Cold War. They were testing everything out at White Sands. Hollow Man. But Project Nightfall, that was distinct. That was the one nobody discussed. She leaned in, her voice dropping. "There were whispers, Paul. Things the newspaper wouldn't print. A tremor in the summer of 1968. That wasn't an earthquake. Ambulances seen entering the base late at night, not departing. Strange lights. Then, just as abruptly as it commenced, it ceased. Complete silence. They shut it all down, classified it, buried it as if it never occurred." Paul sat motionless, the mug growing cold in his hands. This corroborated the ledger entry. "Anomaly site lockdown permanent." "But why are you truly asking, Paul?" Chloe's gaze was piercing. "You must know your father worked on it." Paul's head snapped up, his heart pounding. "What? I knew he worked at Hollow Man. I never knew the project name. He never spoke of it." Chloe's expression softened instantly, profound, old sadness filling it. "Oh, Paul, I'm sorry. I just assumed you knew. Mason, your father. He wasn't simply on the project. He was their safety engineer." Safety engineer. The words from the ledger. MW recommending immediate halt. "I remember him," Chloe continued softly. "He was a good man, meticulous. He used to visit the library to read geology journals. He always seemed to be concerned about something. I saw him in town right before they shut it all down. He looked haunted, Paul, thin as a rail. He told me he was worried about the structural integrity. That was his phrasing." She took a sip of her tea, her hand trembling slightly. "And then, after it all stopped, he passed away right after the project was officially terminated." "A heart attack," Paul uttered automatically, repeating the narrative he'd absorbed throughout his entire existence. "A sudden heart attack in 1973. Chloe met his gaze, her eyes lucid and unwavering. "He was 45 years old, Paul, and he had just passed a physical. The doctor said he had the heart of an ox." She paused, allowing the gravity of her words to sink in. "Some of us, the older families, we always found that suspicious. A man that meticulous, who was attempting to raise an alarm, dying so abruptly right after his project was interred. It simply felt too neat. Paul felt the blood drain from his face. The vague childhood tragedy of his father's demise, a sorrowful but random act of nature, suddenly congealed into something chilling and deliberate. It was murder. His father had been silenced. Chloe observed the shock and anger solidify on his face. She leaned forward, placing her delicate hand on his arm. "Paul," she said, her voice firm, drawing him back. "You inquired, and I informed you, because you are Mason's son. But now you must heed my words." That was 60 years ago. The men who perpetrated that, the sort of men who commit such acts, they don't simply vanish. They age. They gain more influence. You are disturbing specters, Paul. Potent specters. You must allow them to rest. You have to let the past slumber. Paul was speechless. He merely nodded, his throat constricted. He rose, the chair scraping against the floor. Jax was instantly at his side, sensing the abrupt shift, his body tense. "Thank you for the tea, Chloe." His voice was hoarse. "Just be cautious, Paul. You appear as haunted as your father once did." As he reached the door, she added, attempting to alleviate the tension. "You're as stubborn as he was, too. Just like my nephew, Ben Sullivan. He's an investigative reporter up in Albuquerque, always unearthing matters that are better left buried. It runs in the family, I suppose." Paul nodded again, not truly registering the name. He simply needed fresh air. He expressed his gratitude and stepped out into the brilliant, hot sunlight. Jax at his heel, he entered his truck, his mind reeling. Safety engineer, suspicious, silenced. He started the engine, his hands trembling. He pulled away from the curb, his eyes automatically checking the rearview mirror to merge, and he froze. A block down the street, parked in the deep shade of a cottonwood tree, was a black, pristine SUV. It was too distant to discern the faces inside, but the sun glinted off the clean windshield. It was them, Tucker and Reese. They hadn't merely come to his house in the dead of night. They hadn't just been making assumptions. They had followed him. They were observing him at this very moment. Paul's blood ran cold. He glanced from the SUV in his mirror back to Chloe's small, vulnerable house. They hadn't just seen him. They had seen whom he was speaking with. Chloe's warning echoed in his head. Let the past sleep. Paul gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He looked at the SUV in the mirror, and a cold, familiar rage, the kind he hadn't experienced since the army, began to ignite in his chest. It was too late. The past was wide awake. The drive back to the ranch was the longest 15 minutes of Paul Weston's life. He drove below the speed limit, his gaze fixed on the rearview mirror, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The black SUV was gone. It had vanished as if it were a hallucination, but the cold sweat on Paul's neck was undeniably real. They hadn't just trailed him. They had watched him converse with Chloe. They knew he was asking questions. Jack sat in the passenger seat, his body rigid. The dog wasn't relaxed, sniffing the air from the window. He was sitting bolt upright, his head swiveling, watching the empty scrubland pass with a low, anxious intensity. He was mirroring Paul's own paranoia. "They're real, aren't they, boy?" Paul said, his voice a dry rasp. When they reached the ranch, Paul didn't just park. He drove past the house, got out, and locked the heavy cattle gate at the entrance to his property, a chore he hadn't bothered with in years. It was a flimsy defense, but it was something. Inside the house, he pulled every blind, shutting out the bright, indifferent sun. The small ranch house was plunged into a dim, dusty twilight. He stood in the silence, his heart hammering. He was a target. His home was no longer a sanctuary. It was a compromised position. He needed to hear the tapes. He remembered his father's old workshop, a lean-to attached to the barn that hadn't been entered since Mason's death. It was full of old electronics, capacitors, and wires his father had tinkered with. Paul left Jax in the house, instructing him to watch the door and cross the yard. The workshop was musty, smelling of dust and dried oil. In the back, under a stiff canvas drop-cloth, he found it. A heavy, beautiful Akai reel-to-reel player, his father's prized possession. He carried the heavy machine back to the kitchen, his fortress, and set it on the table. He retrieved the small gray metal box from his wife's cedar chest. His hands, usually so steady with tools or a rifle, trembled as he opened the first tape. He threaded the thin brown ribbon of plastic through the machine's guides. It felt like handling a bomb. He took a deep, shuddering breath and flipped the power switch. The machine hummed. A small amber light glowed. The reels began to turn slowly, silently at first. Then came a low electric hiss of old magnetic tape passing over a playback head. A faint click, and then a voice. Test, test, October 3rd, 1968. This is Mason Weston. This is a private recording. Paul froze. His breath caught in his chest. It was a voice he had only known from the hazy, fractured memories of childhood. It was his father, younger, clearer, and more alive than Paul had remembered. But it was him, the calm, measured cadence of an engineer. Jax, sensing the sudden sharp intake of breath and the tremor that ran through Paul, got up from the door and came to his side, pushing his cold nose into Paul's rigid hand. "It's okay, boy," Paul whispered, his eyes locked on the turning reels. He couldn't look away. "It's my father," the voice from the tape continued, and the kitchen filled with the words of a ghost. "This is a private log supplemental to the official record. I am storing these concerns off-site in case the official logs are adjusted, which I fear they already have been." A pause, the sound of a man taking a nervous sip of coffee. "Project Nightfall is not what we told the Congressional Committee. It is not, I repeat, not a geological survey. It is a seismic weapon. The goal is to create and direct controlled low-yield subterranean tremors to destabilize enemy infrastructure from a continent away." Paul sank into a chair, his legs suddenly weak. "A seismic weapon, the tests in July." "Test for Bravo. They weren't a success. They were a catastrophe. We broke something. We breached a deep fault line we weren't supposed to touch. And the resulting fracture hit the Otto Aquifer, the main water table for the entire basin." Paul's mind flashed to the Geiger counter, still buried in the pantry, its needle ticking. Tick, tick, tick. "The sensors in the aquifer are hot," Mason's voice said, the calm leaking out of it, replaced by a strained urgency. "It's not high level, not an immediate catastrophic event, but it's a persistent low-level leak. Radionuclides, strontium-90. I think it's in the water table, and they know. I told them, I showed them the data. They told me to recalibrate the sensors. They're burying it, Paul. They're classifying the leak itself. They've sealed the sublevels, trapping the evidence, and they're calling the project a failure due to geological instability. A lie. It's a cover-up." The voice on the tape was no longer his father, the engineer. It was his father, the man, terrified. "They relieved me of duty today. They said I was unstable, fatigued. They've assigned men to watch my house. They're afraid of what I'll say. They're afraid I'll go public. They're bringing in a containment team from DC to manage the asset and sanitize the site. I think—" The voice cracked. A long, terrible pause filled with tape hiss. "I think they're going to silence me. This isn't just about the project anymore. It's about me. If something happens to me, if it's sudden, it wasn't. It was them. I love you, Paul. Be a good boy for your mother." The tape ended with a sharp click. The reel spun in silence. Paul Weston sat perfectly still. The world had narrowed to the hiss of the machine. "I think they're going to silence me." Chloe's voice, suspicious, tidy, the black SUV, Tucker's empty eyes, Reese's impatience. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a heart attack. It was an execution. They had murdered his father and buried him just as they had buried the bunker. The sadness and confusion that had haunted him since childhood suddenly vanished, burned away by a clean, cold, and familiar fire. It was the rage, the black combat rage he had known in the mountains of Afghanistan. The rage that had kept him alive, that had helped him fight, and that he had spent the last 8 years trying to bury. It surged up hot and total. His vision narrowed. A roar filled his ears, louder than the tape hiss. His hands resting on the table, clenched into fists, his nails biting into his palms, the knuckles white. He wanted to destroy something. He wanted to put his fist through the kitchen wall. He saw the tape player, the machine that had delivered this poison, and had a sudden violent urge to sweep it from the table, to smash it into 1,000 pieces. He rose from his chair, his body trembling with the force of it. "Paul?" The word was a sound, not a voice. He didn't hear it. He took a step toward the machine, his hand raised. Suddenly, a sharp, hard pressure slammed into his right elbow. It was Jack's. Paul was in the red, lost in the blinding storm of his own anger, and he barely felt it. He shook his arm, but the dog was insistent. Jax pressed again, this time exerting his full mass, driving his cold, wet snout firmly against Paul's taut forearm, while a shrill, persistent whine pierced through the ringing in Paul's ears. Paul paused. He gazed downwards, his breathing ragged. Jax was no longer merely a companion. He was a service animal executing his most vital duty. He was looking up at Paul, his entire body rigid, his eyes fixed on Paul's. He whimpered again, a high-pitched, desperate sound, a fusion of inquiry and command. "Are you present? Return." The fury, which had manifested as a solid, roaring wall of fire, shattered. Paul examined his hand. It was clenched so tightly it throbbed. He forced his fingers to uncurl. They felt numb. He released a huge, shuddering breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The roar in his ears subsided. The kitchen came back into sharp focus. The scent of dust. The hum of the machine. "Okay," he murmured. The word was an admission of defeat. He sank to the floor, his legs giving way. He buried his head in his hands. The rage vanished, leaving in its wake a cold, hollow chasm. Jax instantly moved in, pressing his entire body against Paul's, nudging his head under Paul's arm, whining softly now, licking away the tears that Paul had not noticed were streaming down his face. Paul removed his hands from his face and wrapped them around the dog's thick neck, burying his face in the warm gray and white fur. He held on to the dog, the sole, solid, true entity in his world, and finally allowed the grief of a lifetime, a grief he had misunderstood for 40 years, to pour out of him. He knew. Paul whispered into Jax's fur, his voice thick and broken. He knew they were coming for him, and he was completely alone. Jax licked his face again, a silent, unwavering assurance. Not anymore. The rage had dissipated, as it always did. Paul Weston sat on the floor of his kitchen, the echo of his father's voice still lingering in the air, and experienced the cold, stark clarity that followed the tempest. The grief, now 4 decades old but finally comprehended, settled into his bones, not as a burden, but as impetus. They had assassinated his father. They had observed him, pursued him, and stood on his porch, and they were still at large. He looked at Jax. The dog remained pressed against him, a solid, warm presence, his head resting on Paul's knee, his own breathing finally calm. Paul stroked the dog's head. "He was all alone, boy," Paul whispered. "I'm not." He was a soldier, and his position was compromised. He was an isolated target, and he was maintaining the objective. He needed an ally. He recalled Chloe's words, a fragment he had barely registered at the time. "My nephew Ben Sullivan, an investigative reporter up in Albuquerque, always unearthing things." He stood, his movements now precise and tactical. He went to the phone, located the number for Chloe Sullivan, and dialed. She answered on the second ring, her voice drowsy. "Chloe, it's Paul Weston. I'm sorry to call so late. I need your nephew's number. It's about my father. It's about Project Nightfall." There was a silence on the line. Then Chloe's voice, all sleepiness gone. "I was afraid of this. I'll text it to you. Be careful, Paul. Please." A minute later, his phone chimed. He dialed the Albuquerque number. A young, sharp, and skeptical voice answered. "Ben Sullivan." "Mr. Sullivan, my name is Paul Weston. Your Aunt Chloe gave me your number." "Yeah, Mr. Weston, she called me," Ben interjected. His voice was rapid. A city voice. "She said you were asking about Project Nightfall. Look, my aunt is great, but she loves local lore. I'm a reporter, sir, not a ghost hunter." Paul felt a flash of the old rage. He suppressed it. "I don't have time for your skepticism, Mr. Sullivan. I'm not calling about lore. I'm calling about proof. I have his voice." "His voice? Whose voice?" Paul placed the phone next to the reel-to-reel player. He pressed play. Mason Weston's strained, terrified voice filled the kitchen and the phone line. "I think they're going to silence me if something happens to me, if it's sudden." It wasn't. It was them. Paul stopped the tape. The silence on the other end of the phone was absolute. He could hear the faint sound of Ben's breathing. "Mr. Weston," Ben said, his voice completely transformed. The skepticism was gone, replaced by a cold, stunned seriousness. "Where are you?" "No, don't tell me over the phone. I'm leaving Albuquerque now. It's a 3-hour drive. Don't talk to anyone. Don't go anywhere. Lock your doors. I'll be there by 2 a.m. A scraping sound emanated from the porch, and Jax let out a single low woof. 2 miles away on a high, dark ridge overlooking the ranch, Tucker lowered a pair of thermal imaging binoculars. He watched Paul Weston's heat signature move from the window back to the center of the house. "He's active," Tucker said, his voice a flat, calm whisper in the dark. "He's on the phone." "He's spooked," Reese said, his voice tight with annoyance. He was rubbing his arm where Jax's muzzle had pressed. "Let's just go down and take it." "You want to go against that dog when he's awake?" Tucker said, "No, we wait. We're authorized for surveillance, not forced entry. We wait unless the situation changes." The situation changed at 1:40 a.m. A new set of headlights appeared. A dusty sedan, not a black SUV. Tucker watched the new man get out of the car. He saw Paul let him in. "Reese," Tucker said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Run the plate." Inside the house, Paul was face-to-face with Ben Sullivan. He was young, perhaps late 20s, with a shock of messy dark hair, glasses, and the nervous, caffeinated energy of a man who thrived on deadlines. He looked more like a college student than a serious journalist, but his eyes were sharp, intelligent, and scanning everything in the room. Jax had sniffed him thoroughly, and after a moment, gave a tentative low wag of his tail. Ben, to his credit, had respectfully waited for the dog's approval before stepping inside. "You brought the police?" Paul asked, his hand on Jax's head. "No," Ben said. "The police file a report. This is something else. Let me see it. All of it." For the next hour, Ben sat at the kitchen table, his face illuminated by the small lamp, his hands in latex gloves he'd brought. He examined the ledger. He stared at the ticking Geiger counter. He looked at the tapes. "Paul, this is..." Ben's voice was a whisper. He looked up, his eyes wide. "This isn't a local story. This is dynamite. This is 60 years of a federal cover-up. Your father..." On the ridge, Reese lowered his own phone. "The plate is registered to Benjamin Sullivan. He's a reporter, an investigative reporter for the Albuquerque Journal." Tucker let out a long, slow breath. His eyes were cold. "He's involved the media. The asset is compromised." He picked up his own satellite phone. "The situation has changed. They're planning to leak. I'm authorizing sanitation now. What's the play? Reese asked, a new eager tension in his voice. Simple. You retrieve the assets. I'll create a diversion. Inside, Ben was carefully placing one of the tapes back in the box. We need to get this evidence out of here. We need to get it to my office, to our servers. Jax, who had been dozing at Paul's feet, suddenly shot up, his head snapping toward the back door. A low, menacing growl rumbled in his chest. Paul was on his feet in an instant. What is it, boy? And then they both smelled it. It was sharp, chemical, acrid smoke. Paul ran to the living room window. His blood turned to ice. The world outside was glowing a flickering, violent orange. Flames were already climbing the side of his barn. The barn, my hay, it's on fire. All his training, all his instincts screamed at him. Save the ranch, save the feed, it's your livelihood. It was a brilliant diversion. Stay here, Ben, lock the door behind me, Paul yelled. He grabbed the heavy fire extinguisher from the wall and sprinted out the front door, running toward the inferno. The moment Paul was 50 yards away, preoccupied by the wall of fire, Reese kicked in the back door. The wood splintered, the lock burst. Ben Sullivan screamed, scrambling back. Reese, his face covered by a black ski mask, was on him. Where are the tapes? Give me the box now. He grabbed Ben by the shirt, but he had forgotten about the dog. Jax had been trained to protect Paul, but in that moment, he knew the house and the man inside it were under attack. He exploded from the living room. He wasn't a service animal. He wasn't a pet. He was a 90 lb German Shepherd in full protection mode. Reese saw the gray and white blur too late. Jax didn't bark. He launched himself, hitting Reese square in the chest, knocking the larger man backward over a chair. Reese bellowed in rage and pain. He tried to get his arm up, but Jax was faster. He did exactly what he was trained to do. He latched onto the man's arm, his jaws clamping down with sickening force. A terrible wet sound of teeth sinking deep into the fabric and flesh of Reese's forearm echoed in the room. Reese screamed, a high, agonizing sound of pure pain. He was a trained operative, but he was in a brutal, primal fight. He tried to shake the dog off, but Jax held on, his muscles rigid, his head shaking, dragging the man. Outside, Paul heard it. A human scream, followed by a sound he knew even better. The sound of Jax in a true fight. A diversion, he hissed, dropping the useless extinguisher. He had been tricked. He sprinted back to the house, his heart pounding with a new cold terror. He burst through the broken back door. The kitchen was chaos. Ben was on the floor. Reese was on his back, trying to get his gun with his free hand, screaming while Jax was still attached to his other arm, a furious, snarling mass. Paul didn't hesitate. He was a ranger. He crossed the room in 2 bounds and hit Reese with a shoulder tackle that sent the man's head crashing against the kitchen cabinets. Paul was on him, one hand grabbing the man's gun hand, the other delivering a hard, precise strike to his throat. From his vantage point, Tucker observed the unfolding disaster of the plan. He couldn't secure a clear shot at Paul, and his foremost priority became extracting his partner. A new diversion was imperative. He aimed his rifle, not at the residence, but at the 50-gallon diesel drum Paul stored beside the barn. A sharp, metallic crack of a high-velocity rifle shot reverberated across the yard. The drum exploded. A blinding whoosh of expanding air, a deafening concussion, and a massive fireball erupted, transforming the night into a brilliant, hellish day. The shockwave jarred Paul's teeth. The heat flash was instantaneous, a wave of blistering temperature that surged through the kitchen window, so intense it fractured the glass. The sudden concussive thump, the scent of burning fuel, the wall of searing heat. Paul froze. He wasn't in his kitchen. He was in Afghanistan in 2003. The Humvee before him had vanished. The air was ablaze. He was deaf. He was paralyzed. His mind screamed, "Move!" Yet his body remained locked, ensnared in the memory of an IED. It lasted mere moments. 1.5 seconds. That was all Tucker required. Within that 5-second window of Paul's paralysis, Tucker had already breached the back door. He seized Reese by his vest, yanking him with preternatural strength, tearing his arm from Jax's grip. Paul blinked. The kitchen swam back into focus. He witnessed Tucker dragging the screaming, bleeding Reese out the door. "No!" Paul roared, scrambling to his feet. He lunged, but it was too late. He reached the porch just in time to see Tucker toss Reese into the back of the black SUV. The engine roared to life. Paul instinctively reached for the pistol he didn't possess. The SUV fishtailed in the gravel, spewing dirt, and sped off into the darkness, its red taillights rapidly vanishing. The yard fell into an abrupt silence, save for the furious, deep-chested barking of Jax, who stood on the porch, his muzzle dark with blood. The hay barn was a complete loss, a towering pillar of fire against the dark sky. Paul, my Ben Sullivan stumbled out, coughing, his face pale with shock. Paul ignored him, his eyes meticulously scanning the darkness, his adrenaline plummeting. He knelt. "Jax, here boy, are you okay? Are you hurt?" He ran his hands over the dog, checking for any injuries. Jax was unscathed, merely vibrating with intense rage. "Paul," Ben repeated, his voice quivering. The dog. "He did his job?" Paul stated, his voice devoid of emotion. He stood up, his gaze falling to the kitchen floor, illuminated by the orange glow of the fire. There, in a small, dark pool of Reese's blood, was a glint of brown leather. It wasn't merely a scrap of cloth. It was a man's wallet, torn from Reese's pocket during the struggle. Paul picked it up. His hands were now steady. He flipped it open. A Virginia driver's license for Reese Hogan, and tucked behind it, a laminated white card. It featured a magnetic strip and a photo of Reese. It read, "Ethel Red Solutions," and beneath, 2 words, "Defense Logistics Contractor." Paul looked at the ID, at the man's face. He looked at the company's name. The Spectres finally had an identity. The world was a cacophony of chaos, sound, and heat. The massive, deafening roar of the diesel-fueled inferno was a tangible presence, a living monster gnawing at the foundations of Paul's livelihood. The hay barn was a towering orange flame, sending a column of black, greasy smoke into the pre-dawn sky, illuminating the ranch in a flickering, hellish light. Paul Weston stood in the dirt, his heart pounding not from the fire, but from the adrenaline of the struggle. He felt the phantom heat of the IED on his face, a memory that had cost him invaluable seconds. "Paul, are you okay?" Ben Sullivan was on the porch, his voice trembling. He was pale, his eyes wide with terror, a smear of blood, Reese's, not his, on his jacket. Paul didn't respond. He looked down at the object in his hand. The wallet. Reese Hogan, Ethel Red Solutions, Defense Logistics Contractor. He looked at the burning barn. A total loss. Years of hay, equipment, memories. All of it reduced to ash. They had attempted to erase his past and his future in a single night. He turned and stalked back to the house, his movements clipped and precise. "Ben, inside now." "What? What about the fire?" Ben stammered, his eyes fixated on the inferno. "It's gone," Paul stated, his voice flat and cold. "They'll be back. Bar the front door. Use the heavy armchair." He stepped through the shattered frame of his back door. The kitchen was a wreck. Splintered wood, an overturned chair, and a dark, sticky pool of blood on the floor where Jax had made his stand. Jax was already inside, moving restlessly, his muzzle still dark. He whined, a low, angry sound. "I know, boy," Paul said. He looked at Ben, who was staring at the blood, appearing as though he might be sick. "Ben, focus." Paul's command cut through the reporter's shock. Ben looked up, his face hardening as his journalistic instincts battled against the terror. "You're right." Okay. The ranch is compromised," Paul said, his voice low and tactical. They failed to get the originals, but they know we possess them. They know you're here. They will return, and they won't knock. What do we do? Ben asked, his voice shaking but steadier. We save the copies, then we hide the originals. Paul moved to his small office nook. He pulled out an old flatbed scanner he utilized for ranch invoices and bank documents. He slammed it onto the kitchen table next to his father's reel-to-reel player. You said you have a secure server. The journals, Ben said, nodding, his adrenaline surging. Encrypted off-site. They can't touch it. Good. For the next hour, the kitchen transformed into a frantic data center, illuminated by the flickering orange glow from outside. While Jack sat at the broken back door, a silent, unmoving guardian, growling lowly at every gust of wind, the two men worked. Paul opened the fragile ledger. Page by painstaking page, he laid it on the glass. The scanner hummed, its white light passing over his father's meticulous faded blue ink. Ben sat at the table, his laptop open, the files uploading one by one. Got it. Page 1, page 2. Mason Weston recommending immediate halt. Ben whispered, reading as the images appeared on his screen. Paul, this is history. It's evidence, Paul corrected, his voice harsh. When the ledger was complete, he took the wallet. He scanned the driver's license. Reese Hogan. He scanned the Ethel Red Solutions access card. Ethel Red, Ben muttered, typing the name into his search bar. They're a ghost. Private logistics, big DoD contracts based in Virginia. They're one of those, the ones who clean up messes. They just made one, Paul said. Finally, the tapes. They couldn't be scanned. Ben pulled out his smartphone and opened a professional audio recording app. It's all I've got, but the quality's high. Play it. Paul rewound the first tape. He hit the button once more. Mason Weston's voice filled the small kitchen, this time being captured digitally. The hiss, the fear, the warning. I think they're going to silence me. As his father's voice spoke, Paul looked at Ben. The young reporter was no longer skeptical, no longer merely a journalist. He was terrified, outraged, and completely, fully invested. The attack had made it personal. When the last tape was recorded and the file uploaded, Ben finally sat back. It's done. It's safe. The data is in the cloud. They can burn this house to the ground. They can't erase it now. Paul nodded. He looked at the physical items on the table. The warped ledger, the 3 plastic reels, and the bloody wallet. Ben was right about the data. He was wrong about the evidence. They'll say the digital copies are fake, Paul said quietly. They'll say I fabricated them. A grieving, unstable son, a sensationalist reporter. Ben opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. He knew Paul was right. The originals, Paul continued, his gaze distant. They're the only thing that matters. The mold on the paper, the magnetic signature on the tapes, the blood on the wallet. That's the truth. He stood up. He knew what he had to do. The cedar chest was compromised. The pantry was compromised. The entire house, the entire ranch was a target. He went to his workshop, or what remained of it, near the burning barn. The heat was intense, but he found what he needed. A heavy military surplus ammunition can. It was steel with a thick rubber gasket in the lid, designed to be waterproof. He brought it back inside. He carefully placed the items inside the cold, dark steel. The ledger, the 3 audio tapes, and finally, the leather wallet belonging to Reese Hogan. Paul latched the can. The heavy metal lever snapped shut with a solid, final sound. The originals were sealed. What are you doing? Ben asked. Staying one step ahead. Watch the road. Don't let anything get near the house. Yell if you see anything. Jack's with me. Paul picked up the ammo can and a short, military-style entrenching tool. He stepped out of the broken door and into the smoky yard. The barn was now a roaring bonfire, a funeral pyre for his old life. He ignored it and walked not toward the house, but toward the north pasture, toward the source of it all. Jax didn't falter. The dog understood the mission. He moved like a wolf, fanning out ahead of Paul, a gray shadow in the orange-lit smoke. He would stop, his head held high, sniffing the wind, his ears twitching at the distant crackle of the fire. He was watching their perimeter. He was standing guard. Paul reached the silent, cold bulldozer. He reached the heavy steel hatch he had covered. He didn't need to move the machine. He didn't need to open the bunker. His father had been buried in secrets in that hole. He would bury the truth beside it. He went to the edge of the hole they had dug 2 days prior, the one that exposed the hatch's frame, the very spot where Jax had first started digging so frantically. He looked at his dog. "Watch," he commanded. Jax sat, but not at ease. He sat like a soldier, his head up, his gaze sweeping the dark tree line, his body ready to spring, a low rumble never leaving his chest. Paul dropped into the pit. He knelt down by the sturdy steel framework of the hatch. He started to dig, not downwards, but horizontally, burrowing into the densely packed earth beneath the hatch's rim. He scraped at the soil with his entrenching tool, fashioning a new, deep hollow in the ground that had concealed the secret for 6 decades. He dug until his arm was immersed up to his shoulder. It was deep. It was hidden. He scanned his surroundings one last time. The atmosphere was thick with smoke. The only audible sounds were Jax's low, steady growl and the distant roar of the fire. He pushed the steel ammo can deep into the cavity he had created. He refilled the hole, packing the dirt back with his hands, compacting it flat until it was as firm as the surrounding earth. He scattered loose soil over the spot, then extracted himself. He stood for a moment, breathing heavily. The originals were secure. They were not within the house. They were not within the barn. They were interred deep beneath the earth at the very site of the offense, concealed by the item they had been mandated to safeguard. He remounted the bulldozer. He ignited the engine. The loud diesel rumble offered comfort. He lowered the blade and propelled the machine forward, covering not merely the hatch, but the patch of fresh earth beside it, interring his secret under 10 tons of cold steel. He shut off the engine and sat in the stillness, the black smoke drifting around him. He looked down. Jax was at the base of the bulldozer, gazing upwards, his tail executing a single slow wag. Paul dismounted and knelt, drawing the dog into his embrace, burying his face in Jax's thick, smoke-scented fur. The dog had uncovered the secret. He had defended the dwelling. He had stood guard while the truth was buried. "It's safe, boy," Paul murmured, his voice strained. "It's safe now." The morning was calm and cold. The ascending sun, typically a harbinger of warmth, did nothing to alleviate the chill in the air, which was saturated with the black, acrid scent of burned hay and diesel fuel. Paul Weston stood on his porch, holding a mug of coffee, and gazed at the smoking skeletal remains of his barn. It was a complete loss. Ben Sullivan was slumbering in the armchair, his laptop open on his knees, his face pale and exhausted. Jax was not asleep. The large German shepherd sat at Paul's feet, his body rigid, his head raised, his ears surveying, a silent, furry guardian on high alert. They had prevailed during the night. They had lost the battle. Paul felt a cold, hard knot in his stomach. The barn was more than just a structure. It was his livelihood. He walked into his house towards his computer, his movements stiff. He needed to ascertain the financial damage. He needed to see if he could even afford to purchase feed to sustain his remaining cattle through the month. He logged into his bank account. The screen flashed red. A single line of text hovered in the air. Account frozen. Pending federal review. Paul stared at it. The words made no sense. Federal review. This wasn't Daisy Brooks and a foreclosure. This was something different. This was the government. They had missed the originals. So they had paralyzed his life. They were crippling him, stifling him from 1,000 miles away. As if on cue, his phone lying on the table began to ring. It wasn't a typical ringtone. It was a silent, buzzing vibration. He looked at the screen. Unknown number. He signaled for Ben to awaken. He activated the speakerphone. Jax rose to his feet, a low growl already beginning in his chest. Paul pressed the accept button. "Weston, I'm pleased to see you're still with us, Paul." It was Tucker's voice. Calm, polite, and thoroughly chilling. "It appears you had a tumultuous evening, a tragic incident involving that old barn. You truly ought to be more careful with flammables." Paul remained silent. He clutched the edge of the table, his knuckles white. "We find ourselves at an impasse," Tucker continued, his voice as smooth as glass. "You possess something that belongs to my associate. My associate, I'm afraid, is quite insistent on its retrieval, and we, in turn, have discovered something of yours." A new sound emerged over the line. A woman's voice, muffled but sharp, protesting. Paul's blood ran cold. "Let me go. Get your hands off me." It was Chloe. "She's a spirited woman for her age," Tucker said, his voice lowering. "But delicate. I'm afraid we're no longer in her cozy little library. We're in Diablo Canyon." Ben Sullivan, now fully awake, covered his mouth with his hand, his eyes wide with fear. "Aunt Chloe, you know the routine, Paul." Tucker said, "The originals, all of them, the tapes, the ledger, and my associate's wallet. You bring them to us. We hand over the old woman. It's a very straightforward exchange. You have until noon." Tucker provided the coordinates for the canyon. "Come alone. If we see your reporter friend, if we spot a plume of dust from a second vehicle, if we even hear a police radio, she won't experience the afternoon. Is that clear?" The line went dead. Paul stood there, the room's silence roaring in his ears. They had him. They had known from their surveillance that Chloe was his sole link. And in their desperation, they had escalated from a covert cleanup to a capital crime. "We must call the police," Ben exclaimed, his voice frantic, pulling at his hair. "We must—" "And say what?" Paul interjected, his voice a low, terrifying rasp. "That men who don't exist, who work for a company that's a phantom, have a woman they'll kill the moment they hear a siren?" "No." He went to the workshop, retrieved the second identical ammunition can, and began filling it with old rusted tools, a chain, and 2 blank reel-to-reel tapes he'd discovered in his father's desk. He was constructing the decoy. He carried it to his truck and placed it on the passenger seat. He entered, closed the door, and simply sat. He looked at his hands on the steering wheel. They were trembling, not with rage, but with fear, with doubt. He was a 50-year-old rancher with a bad knee, not an Army Ranger. The evidence was on the ground, still smoking 50 yards away. He had frozen. The explosion, the heat, the IED memory had immobilized him for 1.5 seconds. In his world, 1.5 seconds differentiated between life and death. He had let them escape. He had failed. Now he was walking into a trap orchestrated by professionals with an elderly woman's life at stake. He was going to fail again. He was going to get Chloe killed. He lowered his head to the steering wheel. A wave of profound self-loathing and fear washed over him. The tremor in his hands intensified into a violent shake. A sudden, cold, wet pressure pressed against his right hand. He looked down. Jax had emerged from the house and was standing by the open driver's door. He hadn't barked. He hadn't whined. He had simply observed his owner in distress. Now he pushed his heavy gray and white head onto Paul's lap, directly onto his trembling hands. It was not a plea. It was a statement, a solid, warm, grounding weight. Paul looked down into the dog's intelligent, calm eyes. Jax stared back, not with the panic Paul was experiencing, but with absolute, unwavering, simple trust. "You are here. I am here. We are doing this." The dog's faith was a lifeline. It was an anchor in the storm of Paul's own mind. He felt the animal's steady, slow breathing. He took a breath, then another, matching the dog's rhythm. The shaking in his hands subsided. The fog of panic dissipated. His gaze, which had been inward and haunted, sharpened. The ranger was back. "Good boy," Paul whispered, his voice thick. He rubbed the dog's head, then looked up. Ben was standing there watching, his face a mask of fear. "I'm coming with you," Ben stated. "No," Paul said, his voice now clear and cold. He exited the truck. "I'm not. I need you to be a reporter, Ben, not a soldier." He pointed to the high, rocky ridge that overlooked the entrance to Diablo Canyon. "You're going to take my binoculars and your camera. You're going to reach that ridge before I do. You are going to find a spot where you can observe everything and you are not going to be seen. You will film everything. The moment you see them, the moment you see Chloe, you hit record." "What? What if they harm you?" Ben asked. "Then you make them infamous," Paul replied. "Now go." He handed Ben his smartphone. "Call your contact, the state police, Captain Ian Chambers. Tell him precisely where we are. Tell him it's a kidnapping in progress. Rogue federal contractors, veteran under fire. Use those words. Tell him to await your signal. If they intervene too early, Chloe is dead." Ben looked terrified, but he nodded, his jaw set. He grabbed his camera bag and began the long, arduous climb toward the ridge. Paul turned back to the truck. He looked at Jax. "All right, boy, this is it." He opened the back door of his extended cab truck and pointed to the small, dark footwell behind the passenger seat. "Load up in the hole. No sound, no movement until I call you." Jax, as if he understood every word, hopped into the truck, crawled into the dark space and lay down, disappearing into the shadows. Paul covered the space with a heavy dark blanket. Paul got into the driver's seat, the decoy box beside him, and drove toward Diablo Canyon. The canyon was a desolate, rocky scar in the earth, all red rock and shadows. He saw the black SUV parked near a cluster of boulders. He saw them, Tucker, calm as ever. Reyes, his arm in a crude, bloody sling, his face a mask of impatient fury, and between them, Chloe. She was sitting on a rock, her hands tied, her face pale, but her eyes, even from 50 yards, were full of fire. Paul stopped the truck as instructed and got out, his hands visible. He lifted the heavy ammo can. "That's far enough," Tucker yelled, his voice echoing. "Put the box on the ground, then back away." "Let her go first," Paul yelled back. "The box? Let us verify," Reyes shouted, his voice raw with anger. He gestured with his pistol. "All right," Paul said. He placed the heavy steel box on the dusty ground between them. "There it is. Go check it." Reyes, his good hand holding his gun on Chloe, looked at Tucker. Tucker nodded. Ree advanced, his gaze fixed on Paul, and kicked the latch on the container. He opened the cover. Inside, he observed the rusted tools and the heavy chain. His head shot up, his face contorted in pure, unadulterated fury. "It's a fake. That served as the signal. Paul put 2 fingers to his mouth and emitted a single piercing whistle, a sound so sharp and high it cut through the canyon air. For a terrifying half-second, nothing occurred. Then the rear window of Paul's truck shattered outwards in a spray of glass. Jax, a 90 lb blur of gray and white ferocity, propelled himself from his hidden position. He wasn't targeting Tucker. He wasn't just attacking. He was hunting the individual who had harmed his home. He went directly for Ree. Total chaos ensued. Reese shrieked, a sound of sheer terror as the dog he believed to be miles away crashed into his chest, knocking him off his feet. This was the opportunity. Tucker, momentarily stunned by the dog's impossible appearance, turned to assist his partner, his gun hand moving. He never succeeded. Paul was already in motion. He was a ranger once more. He covered the 20th gap in a blur, disregarding the decoy, ignoring the dog. He collided with Tucker, a full-body tackle that slammed the older man's head into the rocky ground. Paul's hand clamped onto Tucker's wrist, smashing it against a rock. A sickening snap echoed, and the gun skittered away. High on the ridge, Ben Sullivan was recording, his hands trembling. "He's in. He's got him. Move in now, now, now." He shouted into his phone. From both ends of the canyon, the sound of sirens, previously silent, erupted. 2, then 4, then 6 state police vehicles, lights flashing, converged on the scene, blocking all escape routes. Captain Ian Chambers, a tall man in a crisp brown uniform, stepped out, his weapon leveled. "Paul Weston, stand down. Jax, off." Paul, hearing the official command, rolled off the groaning, defeated Tucker. Jax, hearing his name from a new authority figure, immediately released the screaming Reese, stepping back, his chest heaving, his muzzle bloody. Tucker and Reese, surrounded, defeated, and broken, were cuffed. Paul walked over and untied Chloe, who was staring, stunned, at the dog. "That," she panted, "is a very good boy." Ben Sullivan, high on the ridge, never ceased filming. He captured the arrests, the weapons, the defeated expression on Tucker's face, and the hero dog. All of it illuminated by the harsh, unforgiving New Mexico sun. The video was grainy, shot from a distance with a telephoto lens, and it shook with the operator's adrenaline. But it was undeniable. It showed 2 men, professional and armed, holding an elderly woman hostage. It showed a lone veteran, Paul Weston, walking into a trap. It showed the shocking, explosive appearance of a gray and white German shepherd launching from a truck window. It showed the chaos, the fight, and the eventual overwhelming arrival of the state police. Ben Sullivan hadn't merely filmed a kidnapping. He had captured the climax of a 60-year-old conspiracy. The Albuquerque Journal didn't just publish the story. They spearheaded a national charge. By the time the sun set on Diablo Canyon, Ben's footage, paired with the digitized audio of Mason Weston's voice, was on every news network in the country. The story exploded. It was a narrative too perfect to disregard. The decorated, PTSD-haunted veteran, the loyal hero dog, the murdered father, the secret Cold War bunker, and the shadowy corporate cleaners, Ethel Red Solutions, sent to silence him. Jax became a national sensation. The dog who fought the ghosts. Tucker and Reese were arraigned, but the courtroom proceedings were the first indication that the victory was incomplete. Ben and Paul sat in the front row, observing. The 2 operatives were not charged with anything related to Project Nightfall. The state, citing ongoing federal investigations of a sensitive nature, prohibited any mention of the bunker, the tapes, or Mason Weston. They were prosecuted for what the world had seen on video. The kidnapping of Chloe Sullivan, the aggravated assault of Paul Weston, arson for the barn, and impersonating federal officers. Ethel Red Solutions, their employer, issued a 1-sentence statement disavowing their rogue actions and then disappeared behind a wall of lawyers. Tucker and Reese, the pawns, were sacrificed. They were found guilty and given long sentences. 2 loose ends, neatly tied up and buried by the system they had served. They were silenced just as Mason Weston had been. "It's not justice," Ben remarked, loosening his tie as he and Paul exited the courthouse. "It's damage control." Paul merely nodded, his gaze distant. He had anticipated as much. The second wave of damage control arrived a week later. The national pressure, fueled by Ben's relentless follow-up articles, compelled Washington to respond. Paul, Chloe, and Ben sat in Chloe's cozy living room, watching the press conference on television. Jax lay at Paul's feet, his head resting on his owner's boot. The podium was occupied by a woman named Emma Collins, the drama's new character, a professional spokesperson, young, polished, and articulate. Her face was a mask of practiced sincerity. She represented the Department of Energy, which had, seemingly overnight, claimed full responsibility for the archived site. "The department," Emma Collins began, her voice smooth, "is deeply concerned by the recently uncovered historical records pertaining to Project Nightfall." "Here it comes," Ben muttered, his arms crossed. This was a long decommissioned exploratory program from the 1960s, Collins continued, which, due to regrettable lapses in Cold War-era record-keeping, was not properly reconciled. We are immediately launching a full federal investigation to review the site, secure its contents, and provide a transparent public report. Paul looked at Ben. They both knew precisely what they were witnessing. It was a public relations whitewash. It was an investigation designed to contain the truth, not to uncover it. They would use words like reconciled, lapses, and archived. They would never use murder, radiation leak, or cover-up. The truth wouldn't be exposed. It would be drowned in bureaucratic paperwork until the world moved on. "They're burying him again," Paul said, his voice so quiet Ben almost didn't hear it. "Not all the way," Chloe asserted, her voice firm. She reached over and placed her hand on Paul's. "They can't." She was correct. The public aspect of the story, at least, had found its resolution. Chloe Sullivan was safe back in her house, rapidly becoming a local celebrity, which she disliked, though she used her newfound fame to lobby for a larger library budget. The Weston ranch was saved. The public outcry directed at the bank had been overwhelming. Daisy Brooks, the loan officer, had personally called Paul, her voice trembling, to inform him that due to the extraordinary circumstances, the bank was freezing all foreclosure proceedings and offering a complete, favorable restructuring. The GoFundMe that Ben had initiated, ostensibly to help rebuild the Hero Dog's barn, had exploded, raising more than enough to cover the loss. The external threats, the bank, the fire, the men in suits were gone. A month passed. The news cycle shifted. The federal investigation was, as predicted, stalled, its findings sealed pending national security review. Life in Otto County began to feel almost normal. The air was cool, the scent of autumn replacing the smell of smoke. Paul Weston stood on the north pasture. In the distance, the frame of a new, larger barn stood tall against the skyline, the sound of hammers echoing faintly. He was not alone. Jax was at his side, his gray and white coat thick in the cool air, his ears alert. They stood together in front of the source. The government had secured the site. The bulldozer had been moved. The hole Paul had dug was gone. In its place was a massive 2-foot-thick slab of new white concrete covering the entire area of the hatch. Stamped in the center were the words, "U.S. government do not tamper." It was a final, arrogant statement, a tombstone for the secret. Paul looked at the concrete, then at the patch of ordinary, undisturbed dirt just beside it, the spot where the bulldozer's track had rested. He knew something that Emma Collins in her polished D.C. office did not. He knew that Tucker and Reese were merely pawns, soldiers following orders, sacrificed when they were compromised. He knew the real players, the ones who had signed his father's death warrant, were still safe, protected by time and bureaucracy. And he knew that the original items were not in that concrete tomb. The real evidence, the leather-bound ledger, the 3 reels of tape, and the bloody wallet of Reese Hogan, was still buried just 5 feet away in a waterproof ammo can in the cavity he and Jax had made. The government had sealed the bunker, but they hadn't found the truth. He looked down at the ground. It was his insurance policy. It was the leverage that ensured this could never be truly, finally buried. Should the official report claim his father was unstable or that the tapes were fake, Paul still held the physical, undeniable proof. He had not won, not completely. He had not avenged his father's death. But he had found something else. He had found the truth. He had survived the fire, and he had confronted the ghosts inside his own head, the ones that had frozen him, and he was still standing. He felt a sudden, profound sense of peace. It was not a happy, triumphant peace. It was a veteran's peace, a quiet, realistic acceptance of the world as it was and his place in it. The war was not over, but his battle was. He rested his hand on Jax's head, the thick fur warm beneath his palm. The dog looked up at him, his intelligent eyes calm, his tail giving a single slow wag. "It's over, boy," Paul whispered. "It's all over." He turned his back on the concrete slab, on the past, on Project Nightfall. He looked toward the new barn, toward the small house, toward the life he had reclaimed. "Come on, Jax," he articulated, his tone distinct and unwavering. "Let's head homeward." The narrative of Paul and Jax serves as a poignant reminder that the most profound fidelity frequently manifests without utterance. It constitutes a serene, steadfast attendance during the most trying periods, a steadfast mooring that prevents us from being cast adrift. If their extraordinary connection resonated with you, we trust you will become part of our collective by subscribing. We would be privileged to receive your perspectives in the comment section. What significance did Jax's unwavering devotion hold for you? Your endorsement enables us to perpetuate the dissemination of these accounts. This tale need not conclude at this juncture. The forthcoming video we have selected for you is awaiting your viewing.